Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So, before we start to dive in today, first, my apologies about the content that went out yesterday. I was having some significant challenges with OBS yesterday. Booted up OBS, and for whatever reason, it went into this a very strange mode. Obviously, all of you could see that, and it took a while to finally figure out how to fix that. But nonetheless, it appears to be fixed, at least for now. Now, yesterday I had briefly talked about, and most of you were unable to see the deep state map that I was trying to show because of what was going on with the OBS. But we're watching broad frontal Russian operations take place now. Earlier in the Russian campaign, the Russians had kind of transitioned to focused operations, specifically on frontline cities such as Bakhmut, other areas as well. Now we are starting to see that change, and part of that change is happening because the Russians now have a strategic reserve. They are continuing to build their military capacity to conduct these large frontal operations that we are seeing today. Now, if we look at what has happened, and we're going to kind of zoom in this area near Prokrovsk, and we're just going to kind of back up, and you, the viewer, will be able to see what indeed has happened as we kind of go back in time here along the entire front of the Prokrovsk area of operations. And then we kind of zoom in, and you, the viewer, will see along this entire front the Russians progressively moving forward, taking territory, enveloping, encircling Ukrainian units, and then destroying those Ukrainian units. As I talked about yesterday, the Ukrainian military is in a dire predicament right now. They're having serious manpower challenges, and the only thing that is really keeping the Ukrainian military in this war is the direct support from the United States and Western European allies, specifically intelligence and some fairly advanced weapon systems that the Ukrainians utilize and continue to utilize from day one in this conflict. And that is what is keeping them in this conflict. But the most important piece of that support is intelligence, real-time intelligence, telling the Ukrainians exactly where the Russians are, what they're doing, what they're preparing to do, and then giving the Ukrainians that total situational awareness. Without that, this war, in all probability, would have been over a long time ago. But it's not. And the war continues, and we are continuing to see this high-pressure campaign by the Russians that is designed along multiple routes of attack now to continue to provide immense amounts of pressure on the Ukrainian military until it breaks the Ukrainian military. And you have to understand, again, and I've talked about this a lot, that the Russians, the Ukraine is the Russian red line. And the Russians have made this choice to go to war, to launch this military operation, not lightly. This was not something that was done lightly, and could probably have been done much earlier by the Russians at a much lower cost. But the Russians gave the West the benefit of the doubt in terms of trying to have a negotiated discussion about ceasing forward easterly NATO expansion. And NATO did not acquiesce, and they continued to expand, and this is kind of where we are today. And this is going to continue. Once the Russians make this decision, they tend not to stop until it is over with. And that normally results in a victory. Again, let's go back and let's look at World War II. Let's look at what occurred with the German Operation Barbarossa, and ultimately what happened. Very successful initially, and then obviously one of the most brutal wars in human history, but ultimately a total Russian victory. And we're seeing that same sort of Russian stubbornness in this campaign. Now, the Russians are doing things a little bit different that at times does surprise me in terms of just total mobilization and ending this. We're not necessarily seeing that. We are seeing mobilization, but we're not seeing mobilization on the scale that you would see if, for instance, Russia went to war directly against NATO. Not seeing that as of yet. Not to say it can't happen and won't happen. We're just not seeing it as of yet. Now, what I wanted to do as well is jump over to the United States, and we're watching some things, some really disturbing things occur. And I tried to touch on this yesterday with the Democratic Socialist primary in New York. You essentially have a person that is not an American. He's been in the country maybe 8 years. He's from Uganda. He's a devout Muslim, and he's also a socialist. And what he appears to be doing on the surface is selling the sweet call of socialism. I will give you everything. You must give me power. I will give you free stuff. You must simply give me power. I will create government-run grocery stores. That's worked out well in the past, hasn't it? You will give me power. I will give you government grocery stores. Now, what's interesting with this individual is eventually, and this is going to happen, his support base are the imported Muslims into the United States from North Africa and the Middle East. And he is going to continue to allow the inflow of all these peoples, these Muslims, into New York City. And then eventually, New York City will transition from a socialist authoritarian state to what is essentially an Islamic state. You will see the tenets of Islamic law start to take place inside of New York City. You're already seeing that in some places, and you're seeing that in Western Europe, as I've talked about before. Compounding that, you have an incredibly low intellect voter base here in the United States now. These young people that are going through these centers of indoctrination, whether it's college, whether it's grade school, are simply being indoctrinated. They don't understand history. They're being fed the positives of socialism and communism, the authoritarian nanny state, where everything is given to you, where you don't have to work for anything. It's just there. And they actually believe that. If you were to interview a majority of college kids aged anywhere from 14 on up to mid-20s now, they are gravitating towards socialism. At one point, Bernard Sanders was an outcast. He was a fringe candidate. Okay? Bernie Sanders was a fringe candidate. Bernie Sanders traveled to the Soviet Union for his honeymoon. The last vice president incumbent for the Democrat Socialist Party, Walz, went to China 30 times 30 times, 30 trips to China. He was an avid collector of communist propaganda. And not only that, individuals in his military unit, individuals that he associated with, believed that he was a communist. He believed in communism. But you're seeing it all over the United States now. And there's going to be two things that could happen. One is you let this occur. You let New York City become socialist, borderline communist. You let that happen. And then you watch what happens. And then essentially they learn the hard way. But that could lead to a general socialist, quasi-communist, New Age liberalism takeover of the United States. Completely change the United States. So people living in Kansas, people living in Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, where this insidious ideology is not really set in yet, with the exception of some of the colleges, that eventually would take power. So the question is, do you let this happen? Do you eventually let, through popular demand, the United States experiment with socialism? Now the problem is once that happens, once they take over, it is very, very difficult to get your constitutional republic back. Very difficult. You become essentially a raw democracy. So if 51% of the population is reliant upon the government to feed them, 51%, and most of these people are living in large cities, large urban areas, that becomes your main voting bloc for the Socialist Party, which is the Democrat Party. If that happens, 51% relying on the government, then you then have a unitary one-party state with their view of democracy. Not a representative republic, but democracy, raw democracy. That's what I like to call it. And if that happens, you lose the Constitution. So the question is, do you let that happen? And then ultimately, to get that representative republic back is usually going to take a revolution or some sort of kinetic force or just a collapse of the economy. What happened with the Soviet Union and other places where this was tried. Or do you say, no, we're not going to allow this to happen? Now, it may take a minority of the people to rise up and say, hey, we're not going to allow this to happen. So under those conditions, you're essentially pausing democracy. What you're saying is half the country, possibly more, are raging idiots and are going to cause the country great harm. And that would be the truth. So if that's the case, then you have to look at the possibility of pausing things. Pausing the traditional way we have done things. We would have to clean things up here in the United States. And unfortunately, that's going to look very kinetic. Neither path is a good path. The longer path is allowing the socialists, the neoliberals to take power. Very, very difficult at that point to then make them relinquish power. Probably much more challenging than pausing the traditional way we have done things until we can clean things up. And even pausing things and cleaning things up is going to be challenging, but probably not as challenging as giving them power and then retaking power. You probably don't want to do that. So the path of least resistance would be option one, which would be a pause on the traditional way we have done things here in the United States. It would require the suspension of certain things. And again, this isn't done because we want to do this. It would be done because we would have to do this. Again, look at AOC. Look at Jasmine Crockett. Look at the guy in New York. Okay? Do you really want those people running your country? And unfortunately, that's kind of where we're heading right now. And it may not necessarily be those individuals. It could be individuals much more radical than those individuals. So that's the question. Do you let them gain power, or do you pause things, not let them gain power, clean things up, and then have a reset, and then back to normal constitutional republic? But I'm not sure we can continue on the path that we currently are with what is happening in the school systems, in these large indoctrination systems, and what's happening in these concentrated areas of the inner city, compounding that they would just bring in more of these troubled societies from elsewhere, their voting bloc, and then they would take power. And again, very difficult to relinquish that power for them. Much, much more difficult to clean things up under those conditions. Hope that makes sense. We'll do more here in the coming weeks as we continue to watch what's happening here in the United States, and then obviously we are continuing to watch what is happening in the Ukraine as well as that conflict continues. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.